We started off the day with federal policymakers, and as everybody in the room knows, so much of the work in managing the electricity system is happening at the state level. And as we've all talked about all day, the electricity system is getting more and more complex, and therefore the job of managing the electricity system is getting more and more complex. And we've watched, several years of declining state budgets and tight situations with increasing demands, policy demands on what the grid should deliver. Over the last couple of years, NARUC, which is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions, and NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officers, have banded together and formed these collaborative task forces and working groups tackling a whole number of issues from integrated planning to microgrids and other things. And we thought it would be, in this panel, interesting to talk about, that policy is changing. We know we've heard about, the need for new regulatory regimes. But we thought it would be interesting to explore this kind of growing interaction between policymakers, regulators, and stakeholders as we go through this very dramatic and quickly changing environment to really also understand the very different roles that each play in the modernization of the grid. So we reached out to NARUC and NASIO, who, as Gil mentioned early in the morning, we are working to deepen our partnerships with both of those organizations because it's the best way for us to help deliver content out to the states rather than trying to go individually state by state. So NARUC and NASIO voluntold two of their board members to join us to have this conversation about this growing interplay between policy and regulation. So we're joined virtually by Commissioner Abigail Anthony. Is she? Hello. Abigail, you're in a room full of about 75, 80 people, all who have stayed here through the entire day. So thank you for joining us. Commissioner Anthony was appointed by Governor Gina Raimondo, now the Secretary of Commerce, to the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission in 2017. She's currently the chair of the Commission on Energy Resources and the Environment at NARUC, and she's the president of the board of the New England Utilities Cybersecurity Integration Collaborative. We're also joined by another commissioner, but he's actually the commissioner of the Energy Office in Massachusetts. Patrick Woodcock joined the Baker administration in 2017 and served as the Undersecretary of Energy in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs for 2 years. He was named the Energy Resources Commissioner in February 2020 and was named the acting commissioner in December 2019. He's also a longtime policy wonk, having worked in the state of Maine in a very similar role, and also here in DC with Secretary Snow on a multitude of climate and energy policies back in the day. So welcome, commissioners. I thought we'd start off, we put out a grid modernization index every few years, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island have tended to be in the sort of the top tier of states embarking on grid modernization. So I thought we'd start by talking about the current grid modernization efforts that are taking place in your respective states and what's driving those efforts and who's leading the charge. So I'll start with you, Commissioner Anthony.
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for having me. I wish I could be there in DC with you, but I couldn't. We had hearings all day today, so this suffices. But yes, so in Rhode Island, we have what I call a pre-modern grid. We have high levels of distributed generation and energy efficiency, long-term contracts, and expectations for increasingly aggressive clean energy requirements. We have a state-of-the-art outage management system, a voltage optimization program, and proactive 3v0 deployment. So the modernization that we're doing now is really all about generator access and the integration of renewables. What looks like modernization to us right now is that when there's a bunch of facilities that are too small to warrant their own interconnection studies, we socialize those upgrade costs because we can't determine who to assign the cost to. But I think that my most formative grid modernization experience was in 2018 when our commission gave pre-approval of funding and base rates for a suite of grid modernization investments. Because we were asked by stakeholders in a rate case to approve funding for a bunch of foundational grid modernization investments to get the ball rolling. The utility didn't want to make the investments because they didn't see what they described as a burning platform. The electric company didn't see a compelling risk of not transforming. And what we were hearing from stakeholders is that the utility needed to modernize in order to meet state goals. The utility was explaining that they can keep adding all of the distributed generation that we wanted with their existing system. So they were really just doing grid modernization to be responsive to their stakeholders. So the stakeholders got the utility on board with making these grid modernization investments by shifting the investment risk to ratepayers. So we granted that pre-approval of the funding and base rates for these investments. Then 2 years into the multi-year rate plan, the utility reported that they aren't really making those investments. As of 2 years ago, the company is on track to collect around $24.5 million from ratepayers for grid modernization investments, but very little of that spending had happened to date, and the company was only projecting to spend $12 million, or about half of that, on grid modernization. So now, with the notice of a sale, National Grid is trying to sell its electric and gas assets in Rhode Island. It isn't clear that we can hold the utility accountable in the future. It isn't even clear what investments we can keep. A lot of those grid modernization investments are actually physically located in Massachusetts, for example. Ratepayers are out their money, and they don't have the grid functionalities or benefits that they thought they were buying. So for me, I learned a lot of lessons about what we can and cannot hold the utility accountable to, and what should be what the role of stakeholders and the role of the regulatory commission is when the case for grid modernization is not coming from the utility itself.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. I've really enjoyed the format to preface my discussions. It's always amazing to see the innovation that's happening within this sector, and to hear it amidst the discussions with the federal government's investments is really exciting. I feel as though in Massachusetts, the level of ambition that we're seeing for the load growth that we are projecting, the integration, similar to how California ISO described it, is really straining some basic core planning and grid management issues. That's certainly a theme that I'm hearing today. I think it's both on the distribution system, most namely in incorporating the amount of solar into our system. I can get into those specifics. We do have a recent order in the last 2 weeks from our department that will alter how we start thinking about planning for investments at the circuit level. And then in the other area is really how we think about our resources just transformed the East Coast, and that's offshore wind. It's just in those few years that I've been with the Baker administration, we thought that we were going to be looking at about 400 megawatts over the next 10 years with annual procurements. We saw economies of scale. We were the first state to move forward with an 800 megawatt project, and every single state just since 2018 has moved forward with similar projects. That is a tremendous opportunity. It is also absolutely going to overwhelm our interconnection points on the East Coast. We are in a 10-year time horizon where we have a procurement. We're hoping to make an announcement in the next 2 weeks before us. I really see challenges at the end of this decade if we don't fundamentally think about transmission system planning, how we allocate those costs, how we think about storage as an asset, both on the transmission system and on the distribution system, that we're going to run into this paralysis that we've seen in some regulatory environments where we really can't justify further investments in solar and in offshore wind. The timing of the federal stimulus is really encouraging. I look forward to the Office of Electricity really developing some core guidelines for the states to think creatively and collaboratively with other states, regional networks. I love the idea about the EV charging systems, thinking about regionally. I think that's the thing that we have to think about on the transmission system as well, to really start thinking about storage as an asset that can overcome some of those challenges and some of the technology and software that were described today.
Commissioner Anthony, I won't forget your issues around accountability. I think we'll come back to those when we talk about how you're going to think about when all of that infrastructure money flows. But I'll follow up on the offshore wind issue right now, because both of your states have ambitious goals to develop offshore wind, which is coupled with the federal goal for 30 gigawatts. And earlier today, we had John Rhodes from the White House, and somebody from the audience asked a question that I was going to ask him, which is really about how those goals are going to shape the transmission system. And you started to touch on it, but when you think about Rhode Island, Massachusetts, the access points for offshore wind to onshore that wind are few and far between, and you bump up against the distribution system. How are these state goals and the federal goals, this push for offshore wind, changing how you're thinking about what the actual network itself is going to look like? Not necessarily how you pay for it or how you permit it at this point, but what do you think that it's going to look like?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of two things. So first, if we decide in Rhode Island that offshore wind is the least cost way to meet our energy needs and also comply with our renewable energy standard, that's going to affect the size and the scope of our grid modernization plans. As I mentioned, grid modernization has been presented to us as necessary to integrate distributed generation. But if we're buying a lot of offshore wind and its RECs and we're hitting our clean energy targets, I can imagine that would affect the state's appetite to continue subsidizing distributed generation at the level we have. So our grid modernization needs might be fewer, or they might be very different in a situation where we're using offshore wind to meet our renewable goals instead of distributed generation. And our grid modernization needs might be different for maintaining reliability when the wind isn't blowing than what our grid modernization needs would be for integrating more and more distributed generation. The other thing that your question made me think of is that the market impacts of offshore wind could also impact our ratepayers' eagerness and ability to invest in other parts of the utility system. So customers in Rhode Island have largely been told that they'll save money from offshore wind procurements. But the best offshore wind procurement or contract that our commission has approved just barely broke even in the final years of the contract, and only broke even because of the plan to sell the RECs from the contract. In that contract, customers will lose hundreds of millions of dollars over the first decade or so of the contract, and then it becomes positive in the final 4 years or so. So if they're losing a lot of money on these contracts, that might impact the utility's ability to invest in other things, including their network or grid modernization. But just generally based on our experience with offshore wind to date, it looks like what's going to happen, at least for a while, is that we're just going to have lead lines coming in. We're just sort of it doesn't seem to be a sophisticated network that is developing, but we're just sort of plugging stuff in.
About a year and a half ago, all 6 New England governors announced a vision statement for New England's energy system, and with that requested that there be a planning process for integrating public policy into fundamental ISO New England planning purposes. That is really reflected in what the FERC ANOPR is saying, that all RTOs should be doing similar efforts of what does the long-term transmission system look like. That is ongoing in our stakeholder process at New England. There's a lot of interesting ideas that I think FERC over the next year is going to be really leading of how RTOs should think about cost allocation for projects that have regional benefits, both for reliability, for cost efficiency, and for meeting public policy goals. And it's the most significant FERC proceeding that I've seen in a decade has huge implications of how we think about transmission system planning. Fundamentally, the reason why we're moving forward with this generator lead line is it's very hard for Massachusetts to justify moving forward with a more integrated system when those benefits would be spread across the entire region. So each state pursues individual projects at the least cost, at the highest benefits, for all the reasons that Commissioner Abigail stated, really that we are sensitive about these pricing. So how can you justify a huge build out when that would be borne by one state?
Mm-hmm. So that's, we've been talking about the drivers of grid modernization and whether you have goals or not. These things are coming at you. And for sure, if you are a state without carbon goals or targets for renewable energy, you're going to have electric vehicles in your state. You're going to have corporate procurement of renewables. Massachusetts is a leader in clean energy programs. You had one of the earliest RPSs and rebates to EV drivers. You now have rebates for EV trucks. When you've been thinking about these programs to incentivize electric vehicles, which is kind of the flip side of utility scale renewables, it's the individual but aggregated change in demand at the distributed level. What has the state been considering in terms of the impact of the policies, the incentives for electric vehicles on the grid needs? And I'm going to ask you a similar question, Commissioner Anthony, but really about how you as a regulator are responding to these policy directives.
Yeah, we do have a docket right now looking at utility investments, and the structure that we have in Massachusetts, what I think is fairly similar, is we have a platform where we have allowed utility make-ready programs for building out the charging infrastructure. We do have a very limited role of what they can do beyond that, trying to retain a competitive marketplace. They're always trying to go a little further in how they try to be a part of the transition. I think this is actually next month, we're going into hearings on this issue of should they be doing specific subsidies in environmental justice communities because of the unbalance of a competitive market might not be deploying that infrastructure in those areas. I think we do see managed charging is a core part of the utility experience that really utilities should be managing, controlling, and there should be a relationship between how utilities can encourage people to use off-peak. That's something we've seen some success with in Massachusetts. But we are still, I think every state is grappling with what is the specific utility role. Although I will say, having just been at the NASDO meeting, it is incredibly encouraging that every state, irrespective of the political or climate goals, every state was really full bore on electrification for a number of different reasons, but it really was uniform.
And then Commissioner Anthony, in terms of thinking about electric vehicles being deployed and then the impact on the grid and how some of the costs are being invested through the utilities that come to you for cost recovery. How are you thinking about the driver that's coming from a state policy that's ending up in your purview?
Yeah, so as Patrick just said, the thing that I'm thinking the most about, and I think most of my commissioner colleagues are is what is the appropriate role of the electric company in electrification? And that role is clear to me, and that's that the electric company should be laser focused on how to serve new load at the lowest cost. And, that is the only way that we have a chance of ending up with sort of positive rate impacts for customers if the revenue from electrification exceeds the marginal cost to serve that new load. Electrification is the opposite of energy efficiency. It will require increased generation assets. It will require increased renewable energy compliance. It will require new distribution and transmission infrastructure. And that the role of the electric company is to mitigate those costs. And as as Patrick just mentioned, that's through things like managed charging. But our job as utility regulators is to make sure that they are, laser focused on serving new load at the lowest cost, so that we can, keep the marginal cost to serve under the average cost to serve load.
About this interplay between the state policy and the regulations, and one of the themes of this particular panel was this joint NARUC-NASIO greater working. And when I was working in Nevada, the state legislature passed a law that required the state to do a study on battery storage, on storage in general, and the state energy office paid for a study, and the state public utility commission opened a docket to take public comment on that study, and then to try to figure out whether there were ways that they could learn from that docket about a regulatory regime for, but also the state would learn from this study as well what the policy angles were. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how you at the state energy office are working with your commission, and how you at the commission are working with the energy offices.
A huge focus of Massachusetts for the last 4 or 5 years of looking to integrate storage into every type of our energy program. It's part of our solar program, the SMART program. There's an additional incentive if you're paired with storage. We have developed a clean peak standard to have an attribute market to actually incentivize to address some of the CAISO issues that they're having out there, to ensure that we have solar available at peak loads. It's part of our energy efficiency program as a daily dispatch. But the interaction, to answer your question, Massachusetts legislature decided that utilities would be able to own and rate-based storage. The way that this has moved forward is in rate cases. They have proposed specific projects. We then comment as the state energy office of which storage projects we think are in the public interest. What is it displacing? The Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, areas that have peak load issues, and also cable issues into a growing peak demand. So what are the use cases that we do think an actual utility asset makes sense? That's the construct we've developed in Massachusetts.
And then,
Karen, I believe, was your question about how we work with state energy office, or with our state energy office?
so I got an answer on storage, which was, I was going to probe storage policy a little bit more, but my question was it was twofold. I was using the storage example as a highlight of how the two agencies are working together in new and interesting ways.
Yeah. So, I think state energy in Rhode Island, our state energy office made a choice to be a party, a mandatory party in our dockets, and that's not a bad role for them. That's a good role for the state energy office, but it means that we can't work with them. So we also, are really separated from our governor's office in terms of directing policy. So most of what we do as, the utility regulator is we review the work that others have done in coordination with each other. So, right now, if there's parties and agencies that are coordinating over storage policy or how to spend federal funds, so that sort of comes before us or comes into us through our hearing room, through a utility filing, and we're looking at the whole filing. But what we do, or what I do, I would say, is, mainly work with other commissioners in different states around the country through NARUC, through our regional organization, and informally, I work with other utility commissioners on the various aspects of running retail markets for electricity, including, and natural gas, but including storage or, the role of electrification, for example.
Yeah, our Department of Energy is an intervener in most cases before the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts. We do work on big, high-level issues like grid reliability. Certainly brief the governor collectively on key tasks, but we really are an intervener in a lot of the specific dockets.
So there's a couple of things to unpack here. We had a conversation earlier, which I think you referenced, which was about a regional EV charging highway collaboration. And I raised the issue about this massive amount of federal funding that's going to be coming into the electric vehicle space for charging infrastructure. And then also on the other side, in the tax side, the incentives for consumers, which will accelerate, electric the electrification of transportation. But it also creates this interesting piece where the money is going to go to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the likely recipient of the money for that EV charging is going to be the Departments of Transportation in the states. So it's an interesting construct, because in many states, I don't think a regulator of a utility is necessarily dealing with the transportation policy side of things, and the state energy office would potentially be a place where there is a lot of collaboration with the utilities already and a lot of experience in developing, electric vehicle infrastructure. So I'm wondering your thoughts on how, at the state level, we're going to integrate these new players into an existing conversation about the electrification of the transportation system.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting how each state applies the funding. In our situation, our Department of Transportation is saying, "Help, please." And I think we'll have a collaborative effort between our energy office and our transportation office. Yet I am really intrigued, and we've heard similar interest from federal partners, that a regional plan as part of this. Each state needs to put forward a plan for moving forward with this infrastructure. And there's nothing restricting collaboration across the states. In a geographic region like New England, really condensed interactions across the states on a regular basis makes a lot of sense to start at least collaborating to see if there can be some best practices, utilities serving different areas of the same states. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for collaboration, economies of scale across the states, and not reinvent the wheel with these plans.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Anthony, any insights?
No, I don't. I mean, like I said, what we would be reviewing is if the utility is making an investment, even if that investment is subsidized by federal dollars or, largely paid for by federal dollars, we'd be reviewing that when the investment proposal became before us. And I guess the one thing that, I would say is that, the utility is going to want to understand that just because the money is coming from somewhere else doesn't mean that we're gonna say yes to the investment. We're really looking for good business cases for spending the money, even if it's somebody else's money.
We talked a little bit about this when we were having a prep call. There's $11 billion for resilience investments that the utilities can make. There's $5 billion that will go to sort of what you might think of traditional hardening that utilities can apply for. Then there's and half of that's going to go to the states for similar purposes. There's $6 billion for R&D and then demo and it is. I'm trying to grapple with, and I know that DOE is, and we're going to have this workshop tomorrow where we ask this. I'm grappling with how they envision this money flowing out into utility investments in resilience, and what issues you're going to be grappling with in trying to make the approvals for this kind of funding, and how, we'll start with the commissioner view on resilience itself and investments, and then how you might be thinking about this federal partner money.
Yeah, so I mean, we would think about it the same, no matter what the investment is designed for or who's paying for it. But the first way we would prioritize is investments that have already been shown to be needed. So if the utility has things that they can demonstrate there's a need for investment, they should be doing those first. The next place I would be prioritizing is other investments that are cost effective and valuable, but that might be risky for ratepayers to fully fund, because the benefit of that investment flows to society rather than to electric or electric customers or gas customers. So that would be the next best place to spend that federal money. But, as I just said a moment ago, it will be important for utilities and other stakeholders to understand that just because the taxpayers are willing to spend this money, it doesn't change the cost effectiveness of the investment. The way our commission assesses cost effectiveness, we don't exclude cost just because somebody else is picking up the bill. So while having taxpayers chip in for a utility investment may increase the net value for ratepayers, it doesn't change the cost effectiveness of the total investment. And from a regulator's perspective, we're really looking at making solid investments, regardless of who is paying. And this is really, really important money to spend. We won't get another chance at that. And if this money is misspent, really sort of that's it. Like we won't be modernizing our grid. We won't be beating climate change. We won't be improving equity. So we really need to do a good job with it this time. And we're going to be looking for those high value investments where the utility is making a very strong business case before us.
I come to you on this, but I want to follow up, Commissioner Anthony, because I had a conversation with a very large utility, and their CEO was saying, that applying for federal dollars comes with reporting and data requirements, and sometimes it's viewed as onerous, and particularly if you're an IOU and you can get a return on investment, you're kind of like, why do I need the federal dollar? It's displacing private capital, and but the flip side, their advisor said to them, well, your Public Utility Commission is going to look askance at you if you aren't at least trying to reduce the impact on the ratepayer by applying for these funds, which is a little different from what you were saying, which is it doesn't matter where the dollars are coming from. So I love your reaction to that.
No, I think that's not inconsistent, right? Yes, if there's federal money available, they should absolutely be applying for it, whether it's to subsidize investments that primarily benefit ratepayers, and especially in cases where the utility is making investment, but where most of the benefits flow to society or to taxpayers. So I think that is really why this infrastructure spending, for example, on all of the electric vehicle infrastructure and the rebates is so well-timed and so key, is because most of the benefits of electrification, or all the benefits of electrification, actually flow to either society or to electrification participants. But the benefits are really reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from avoided gasoline, oil, or natural gas. And so those are benefits that are realized outside the electric system. So it's really a perfect match to have the federal government subsidize investments in electrification, because that's who's going to be benefiting. So I don't think my perspective is not inconsistent with yours, that the utilities will be, we will, if the money is available, we'll be expecting that they'll be seeking it out.
And how are you thinking about spending all that money that's coming your way?
Well, I mentioned the challenges on the distribution side, the transmission side of incorporating solar and offshore wind. I will say on a customer interaction, there's a lot of things that Massachusetts does right. We have not made the progress of that 1.0 version of smart meter deployment, which may be an opportunity hearing from all the presenters today. With that said, we have a proposal right now from our two utilities to move forward with new metering over the next 7-8 years. Costs hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. I do wonder if there is an opportunity to take, I think the commissioner is absolutely right. You need to get the base case right for ratepayers. But at the same time, are there something that you could utilize the federal funding to do applications that I think I heard that we really need to take a little bit more risk, which for a regulator is very hard to say. But if there is federal dollars and the base case is 1.0 or greater for ratepayers, maybe that is something that we could find appealing. I will say in New England right now, we have core reliability issues. We import LNG into our market. Prices have gone way up. Some of this is European related. but how can we interact with the investments that will enhance foundational reliability? I mean, that's what CAISO was saying. That is certainly where the sleepless nights go for all regulators. So how can we look at enhancing resilience and creating federal funds that hit our vulnerabilities?
So I do want to leave some time for questions. Richie, you were looking for your microphone. You got it in the pocket. So let's open the floor for questions.
I mean, I think I don't see any yet, but it's been a great day, and I want to make sure that, I mean, we heard two great statements from both of our speakers here. I think I was trying to ask, what was the biggest takeaway from the day? And no one's asked Karen any questions yet today. So I might ask you one, but just hearing Patrick, you say maybe there's a little bit more risk to take. And hearing Commissioner Anthony talk about, hey, it's not an automatic slam dunk rate case. I think those are really important takeaways. So I thank you for those. Maybe Karen, you can.
Steve.
We'll get one question, then I will come back to you, Karen, to maybe wrap with, what's your biggest takeaway from today? But first, Steve.
Thanks. I'm not bashful. I'm fascinated with what you guys are doing up in New England because it seems so unique from most of the rest of the country, and particularly the offshore wind is one of your unique things. It's not totally unique to New England, but it's certainly, you guys have been a big driver in that. I hear, I'm with AEIC now, and all my members are utilities, and one of the things I hear from a lot of my utilities is, how do we get that power from offshore, onshore, and all the infrastructure costs that are going to be required to get, megawatts, if not hundreds of megawatts, onshore into the system where it wasn't really designed for that, right? And obviously that's in an area that's pristine, shoreline, which I think you guys like to protect, right? So how has that issue been discussed or debated or amongst either Rhode Island or Massachusetts? I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll give a little bit more detail in it. The first generation of projects are perfect because of where we cited old coal plants, nuclear power plants are on the water. So we are looking at an interconnection point right by a old coal facility that had 2,400 megawatts of capacity. There's an old nuclear power plant in Massachusetts. The idea, the geography of Massachusetts also lays itself, in New England, is that it's not that far if you start looking at HVDC interconnections of whether there's a value proposition of interconnecting right into Boston long term. I do think you're right, though. You start to hit a scale, it becomes an onshore problem. And that will, if we don't solve that, I will tell you, the Biden administration absolutely heard from the offshore wind developers about 12 months ago, and they have been laser focused on that. That is what you're seeing from FERC with this ANOPR, what you're seeing reflected in these investments from the stimulus bill, because there's a real challenge that we build out some infrastructure over the next 5 years, and we cannot justify the economics of the onshore upgrades for further offshore wind.
Other questions? Well, we are the last thing standing between you and prime rib and cocktails. So, Richie, thank you very much to our guests. And I know we've had a long, interesting day. And Commissioner Anthony, you sat through hearings all day, which could have been long and could have been interesting. So thank you for joining us at the end of your day.
We didn't get to put